In April 1912, the Industrial Revolution had minted a brand new class of ultra-wealthy titans in America and Europe. For these people, crossing the Atlantic in an ocean liner was a massive floating status symbol, and the RMS Titanic was the absolute peak of that engineering. The first-class accommodations were absurd by any nautical standard. Passengers had access to private promenades, a heated swimming pool, a squash court, and a Turkish bath. They dined on 10-course meals featuring oysters and filet mignon, completely surrounded by crystal chandeliers and ornate wood paneling. Look at the first-class passenger list and you find a who's who of extreme Gilded Age wealth. You have John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the entire world. There is Benjamin Guggenheim, a notorious mining heir, and Isidor Straus, the wealthy co-owner of Macy's department store. But catering to that level of elite entitlement actively compromised the safety of the entire vessel. Throughout the day on April 14th, the ship received multiple ice warnings from other vessels. Yet the wireless operators were so busy sending out personal, gossipy telegraph messages for the rich passengers that some of the most critical navigational warnings were simply brushed aside. With its remote-controlled doors and specialized watertight compartments, the ship was famously dubbed unsinkable. To the passengers in the luxury suites, human engineering had finally conquered the natural world, creating a deadly illusion that their status and technology made them untouchable. At 11:40 p.m., a massive dark mass loomed directly in the ship's path in the pitch-black Atlantic. The Titanic was too heavy and sluggish to turn entirely. Instead, it grazes the side of the iceberg. The ice scrapes along the starboard hull below the waterline, popping rivets into the freezing ocean. This diagram of the ship's lower hull shows exactly why that glancing blow was fatal. The Titanic was meticulously designed to stay afloat if up to 4 of these watertight compartments flooded, but the ice sliced open 5 of them. 5 flooded compartments was a mathematical death sentence. The ship was going to sink, and the clock was ticking. Up in first class, the reaction was almost comical. The collision barely felt like a shudder in the luxury suites. A few passengers wandered out onto the deck, saw the chunks of ice that had rained down, and started playfully kicking it around. They threw snowballs at each other, treating the impact as a fun little interruption to their evening. While postal workers and stokers were fighting for their lives as freezing ocean water rushed into the boiler rooms, the wealthiest people on Earth were deeply annoyed by the stewards asking them to put on lifebelts. They were entirely unaware that their massive bank accounts could not stop the ocean from swallowing the ship. Eventually, the reality of the situation breached the upper decks. As the bow dipped and the deck slowly began to tilt forward, the atmosphere among the elites shifted from mild annoyance to quiet, desperate panic. The crew began the evacuation, exposing a catastrophic design flaw. The Titanic was carrying over 2,200 people, but as you can see looking at the deck, it only had enough lifeboats for about 1,100. The White Star Line executives knew exactly what they were doing. They intentionally reduced the number of lifeboats installed on the ship. They thought that decking the ship out with the required number of boats would clutter the beautiful first-class promenade deck. They prioritized a clean aesthetic over human survival. The evacuation itself was incredibly chaotic. Because no one truly believed a ship this massive could sink, rich socialites were hesitant to step out over the terrifying drop into the freezing abyss. As a result, the first few boats designed to hold 65 people were lowered into the water with only 28 aboard. Extreme privilege actively backfired. The elites demanded a pristine, unobstructed view of the ocean for their leisurely strolls, and in doing so, they directly eliminated their only mathematical means of escape. With space artificially scarce, the crew enforced a strict rule of women and children first. The most powerful, heavily insulated men in society were suddenly forced into a corner where their wealth could buy them absolutely nothing, and they had to face their inevitable end. Isidor Straus was offered a seat in a lifeboat because of his age and extreme wealth. He flatly refused, stating he would not enter a boat until every woman and child had been evacuated. His wife Ida stepped out of the boat, turned to her husband, and told him that where he went, she would go. They were last seen sitting quietly together in a pair of deck chairs. When Benjamin Guggenheim realized the ship was doomed, he didn't panic or beg the officers for a seat. He and his valet returned to their luxury cabin, took off their bulky life belts, and changed into their absolute finest evening wear. He famously declared that they had dressed up in their best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on the ship, helped his pregnant young wife into a lifeboat. He calmly asked the officer if he could join her to protect her. When the officer maintained the strict rule, Astor simply nodded, kissed his wife goodbye, stepped back into the crowd, and lit a cigar. These men met their fate with dignified resignation in the open air of the boat deck. But directly beneath their feet, deep in the lower levels of the ship, a very different, systemic horror was unfolding. If you transition down into the bowels of the ship, the quiet acceptance on top completely vanishes. For the third-class steerage passengers, the sinking was a pure horror story of panicked entrapment. Many of these poorer passengers were physically trapped. They were locked behind heavy metal gates that rigidly separated the classes. As the lifeboats above were being launched half-empty, the steerage passengers were fighting to navigate a confusing maze of flooding corridors just to reach the open air. This bar chart compares the brutal statistical reality of the disaster. You can clearly see a near-total survival rate for first-class women, but look at the vastly lower bar representing survival rates for third-class women and children. By the time the locks were broken and many steerage passengers finally reached the boat deck, almost all lifeboats were already gone. The ship's physical and social architecture functioned as a filter, dictating the odds of survival based entirely on a passenger's class. By 2 a.m., the immense stress of the water weight violently snapped the ship in half. The bow sank immediately, pulling the stern high into the freezing air before it too filled with water and plunged beneath the surface, throwing over 1,500 people into 28-degree water. The people sitting in the half-empty lifeboats floated in the pitch black. They were forced to listen to the horrific cries of the victims freezing to death in the water around them. Terrified that desperate swimmers would capsize their small wooden boats, the vast majority of those lifeboats refused to row back and help. Just as the sun began to rise, the RMS Carpathia arrived on the scene and pulled the traumatized survivors from the water. When the Carpathia docked in New York, the news shocked the entire globe. Out of the 2,240 people on board, only 705 survived. The freezing Atlantic served as the ultimate equalizer. The richest, most powerful men in the world had built a massive monument to their own invincibility, and nature effortlessly destroyed it in a matter of hours. The ocean did not care how much money you had in the bank, proving exactly what happens when humanity believes it has completely conquered the natural world.